Hello and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is a lecture walking through Roland Barthes' famous essay, The Death of the Author, as part of a series on structuralism. If you are in a textual studies class of mine as well, for credit, sometimes I pair this essay with a work of postmodern fiction. Most recently, as I'm making this Double or Nothing by Raymond Federman. So I will do a separate lecture on Federman's book in relation to this after this, but I usually have people read this essay on their own first, and this is generally just the best way to do any type of reading. Just try to figure it out for yourself first. And then these contextualized reading lectures that I make for the Theory Center are really about supplementing your reading, helping you when reading is unfamiliar to you in terms of discourse, giving broader historical context to things, especially for people who are more advanced readers, but have read this in a philosophy context and not in a literary theory context or a linguistics context and not a theory context. So these lectures are really they're not necessarily always for people who don't know anything about the subject matter, but for people who are willing to do engagement on their own and to supplement their reading and definitely for the folks who are like, what is post-structuralism, or what is deconstruction, or what's the big deal with theory? Like, I don't understand that kind of stuff. Hopefully these lectures are helping people sort of cut through some of the intimidation that can come with how difficult some of the texts are and start helping people to see why these writers aren't necessarily doing this stuff to be difficult or to be obtuse on purpose. They're really trying to work with at I think a generous level with real philosophical and literary theoretical questions. So this essay, Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, I've done Elements of Semiology lecture already on Barthes, so you might want to watch that first before reading this or watching this. This is written around 1967, so this will be coming after Elements of Semiology, and I'm just going to walk us through it here. In the short story Saracen, Balzac, French author Balzac, right? Describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. So that's the quote from this short story. And Barthes goes on to say, who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac, the individual furnished by his personal experience with a philosophy of capital W woman? Is it Balzac, the author, professing literary ideas on femininity? Is it universal wisdom, romantic psychology? We shall never know, for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Now, if you've seen some of my earlier lectures on structuralism, you know that Roland Barthes wrote a text in the 1950s called Writing Degree Zero, and he's been writing in the context of the French Republic, this transition after World War II into the Fourth Republic, and then eventually into the Fifth Republic. And what was going on were critiques of not only, the devastation of World War II, but critiques of the Third Republic, and particularly classism that was rampant in French society. So left-leaning, especially left-leaning intellectuals were wanting to break down older class divisions. And with that were some of the class divisions that had upheld modernity as a literary movement, the idea of so-called high art, or only some people go to the theater or to the opera house, whereas the masses don't. And so a critique of so-called refined tastes. Now, Balzac would have been an author, the fact that Roland Barthes is dealing with Balzac, a 19th century author from France who was taught a whole lot, says something about his context, right? He is really thinking about French literature, but also in the broader context of the socio-political conditions of the mid 20th century. And so in critiquing saying this bold statement, that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin, writing for him is going to be one of the mediums in which we explore what a zero-degree society or what a new society, a reformed society, can be. But it means that we need to focus on writing with a W and not necessarily on a concept of literature, for example. But so where there's more of an attention to the medium itself of production than there is to the ideological content within it. And that's going to be very much part of structuralism, right? We want to look at the structures behind things. If you remember Roland Barthes from the Elements of Semiology lecture, he's talking about not just the food items that are on the menu, but the entire menu itself, and how the menu remixes the different elements of the different foods that show up as different menu items. If you want to change society's structure, you don't change what's on the particular hamburger on the menu, you change the ingredients of the entire restaurant, right? Of what the offerings are. And so coming back to this context, writing is the destruction of every voice, every point of origin. Remember, Ferdinand de Saussure had seen writing as kind of like distanced away from that distinction between long, capital L, language in general, and speech as being the active, present part of the performance of language. Writing is just this kind of snapshot that comes afterwards. And that shift from structuralism to so-called post-structuralism is going to retweak the idea of what writing is. Now, remember also from the Elements of Semiology lecture that Barthes had already taken Ferdinand de Saussure's concept that language is a branch of semiology, or the study of signs, which is a broader discipline. Roland Barthes had said in Elements of Semiology that no, that actually semiology has to be a branch of linguistics. And the reason for that is that when we're talking about the meanings of signs themselves, or the study of signs, semiology, we're already using language, or we're already working within language. Sometimes you hear 20th century critics attributed to various different sources refer to the prison house of language. Can we have thought abstracted from language itself, right? Or do we need to have language in order to be able to have certain thoughts? That's kind of the philosophical question going on here. So as he goes on here, writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral composite oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body of writing. He almost thinks of it like you can imagine like you're in the desert or something, and you dig up an object and there's just writing on it, and we don't know the context or the civilization, we don't know maybe even the language for deciphering. That he's really stepping back, and when he's thinking about what writing might be, he says, no doubt it's always been that way. Um, if you think back to Plato and you think of his two essays that deal, or two dialogues, I suppose, that deal with writing in particular, there's going to be the Gorgias and there's going to be the Phaedrus. And in those texts, Socrates, the philosopher, is very suspicious of writing. This is kind of like new technology. And the reason why Socrates is suspicious about writing is because when you remove writing from the person who writes it, who is saying it, then people can misconstrue it, they can cut it up, they can take it out of context, and then they can hold that person accountable. Now we know what happened to Socrates. He was, executed, put to death for the so-called corruption of the youth. And he probably had good reason to be worried that people were taking his words out of context. But he also seems to, and both Plato, who's writing all this down, and the Platonic concept of truth is going to be a transcendent notion of truth. Now, again, I think Roland Barthes is thinking about that ancient context, but he's also thinking about how decontextualized writing always is, right? And that it's our ideological assumptions about what an author is and our ideological assumptions or adherences to capital T truths as well that corresponds to the idea that you could have something like an author or a single philosopher like Socrates who gives us an authoritative access to kind of truth. He goes on, he says, no doubt it's always been that way. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, that is to say, finally outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin. The author enters into his own death. Writing begins. You're not hearing Roland Barthes right now. Roland Barthes is nowhere to be found. He's dead. He died in the early 80s. You're hearing Roger Green putting his voice to this text that just exists. It's like out in the world. And that's what he thinks about in this decontextualized space is where writing begins. Not the writing of the idea that I'm sitting down to write and put my intention to pen, but the process of writing itself. Like, what is writing is a question. So we got to think about it from that structuralist angle and not from the angle of an individual self that controls intention, right? Because like I can show up at a stoplight with a car and I can say, oh, I'm going to change the meaning so that red means go and green means stop. Because, oh, we can just mix up signs. It's like you try that and you're going to get hurt or somebody else is going to get hurt and a car accident, right? We don't have individual control over intentions of things. And so when we're dealing with writing or we're dealing with language, we're dealing with media or acting within mediums that are socially determined to begin with, right? The sense of this phenomena, he goes on to say, however, is varied. In ethnographic societies, which I've always found that just a weird translation term here, what does he mean by ethnographic? He basically means indigenous peoples here, but why call it an ethnographic society? Is because like ethnography is a kind of writing about peoples, right? So is he talking about the writing that anthropologists have done about actual people's societies? I think that would be cool if that's what he was doing, but I don't think that's what he's doing in this sentence. He's actually seems to be adhering to an idea, some sort of notion of what Euro-Christians think about indigenous societies. But I'll go on with the reading here. In ethnographic societies, the responsibility for a narrative is never assumed by a person, but a mediator, a shaman, or a relator whose, quote, performance, the mastery of the narrative code, may possibly be admired, but never his genius. The author is a modern figure, a product of our society, in which I would use the term Euro-Christian society. Insofar as emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French rationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation, it discovered the prestige of the individual of, as it what more nobly put, more nobly put, the human person. He's talking about intellectual history here, particularly in the Euro-Christian context. Now he doesn't use that term Euro-Christian. That's one of like my terms that I use following my colleague and mentor, Dr. Tink Tinker. And so now we can look back at this idea of intellectual history in part because of thinkers like Roland Barthes, who give us access to thinking about society in different ways. So we look at humanism, right? The humanista, the Latin teacher, that's what the humanists are as they emerge in the Renaissance. A humanist is a Latin teacher, but then that concept, the philosophical concept of humanism, takes off in Euro-Christian culture. And then we later get international or universal human rights, right? All coming out of that tradition. Natural rights philosophy precedes that a little bit, and it's worth its own lecture as well. He says it's thus logical that in literature it should be this positivism, the epitome and the culmination of capitalist ideology, which has attached the greatest importance to the person of the author. The author is the person who gets the royalties, right? When you buy their intellectual book, the author is the name who gets stamped on that book that then gets sold. The author is the person who gets the advance from the publishing company. So he says the author still reigns in histories of literature, biographies of writers, interviews, magazines, as in the very consciousness of men of letters anxious to unite their person and their work through diaries and memoirs. The image of literature to be found in ordinary culture is tyrannically centered on the author, his person, his life, his tastes, his passions, while the criticism still consists for the most part in saying that Baudelaire's work is the failure of Baudelaire the man, Van Gogh's his madness, Tchaikovsky's his vice. The explanation of a work is always sought in the man or the woman who preceded it, in the biography, right? As if it were always in the end, through the more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author who is confiding in us. Now, my students are very quick to point out, especially in kind of literary theory 101 types of classes, that American new critics already had this concept in the 1930s of the author fallacy, the idea that we separate the author. We don't consider, when we're analyzing literature, we don't consider what the author's intentions were. We just look at the work itself, the work in isolation. And that is an idea that the French writers like Barthes and Foucault and Derrida, they have considered what some of the American new critics have said. But I want to bracket that a little bit, because I think that in the ways I've been teaching these structuralism lectures, the idea of writing degree 0 and removing authorship in the ways that this is a critique of class and historical production of a kind of tyranny over the non-refined classes is a completely different context than what American new critics are, who are largely working in the South and are largely aristocratic in their leanings. So it's quite a different context to be thinking about French critics in the 1960s dealing with the idea of the author, and American new critics who are saying that we have the author fallacy. Just pointing that out there. It's worth other lecture series on American new critics, but I'm not going to do that right now. Though the sway of the author remains powerful, says Barthes, the new criticism has often done no more than to consolidate it. It goes without saying then that certain writers have long since attempted to loosen it. In France, Mallarmé was doubtless the first to see and foresee in its full extent the necessity to substitute language itself for the person who until then has been supposed to be its owner. Mallarmé, Valéry, Arthur Rimbaud, French writers of the late 19th century, French writers that burgeon into what we later call surrealism, are dealing with this in a heavy way. This is French high modernist literature. It's the literature that reacts to the realists of earlier writers, Balzac probably being one of them, Maupassant probably being another one. I wouldn't correct Baudelaire is definitely in the late Romantic era as well. But if we think about a famous way to teach this is to think about the sentence by Arthur Rimbaud, I is an other. The first person I is an other. When I use that as a writer, like on the one hand, it's Roger, it's my intentions, but actually when I put the I onto the page, it destroys all sense of me, especially if I like tagged it on a building wall or wrote it on a bathroom wall or something like that. Nobody knows who I am. That's the destruction of my identity as a person as I put myself into writing. And so even as I'm working with my idea of myself as a writer, I've othered myself. I've had a separation. To come back to the way Barthes putting it here, for Mallarmé, for it had been supposed to be its owner. For us to, it is language which speaks, not the author. Later on, Martin Heidegger will say language speaks us. We come into a language that pre-exists. Remember my comments about Levinas versus Heidegger in my earlier lecture as well there. To write is through a prerequisite impersonality, not at all to be confused with the castrating objectivity of the realist novelist. To reach that point where only language acts or performs and not me. Mallarmé's entire poetics consists in suppressing the author in the interests of writing, which is, as will be seen, to restore the place of the reader. Valéry, encumbered by a psychology of the ego, considerably diluted Mallarmé's theory, later poet, right? But his taste for classicism leading him to turn to the lessons of rhetoric, he never stopped calling into question and deriding the capital A author. Remember, I've also brought up Exercises in Style, the Raymond Queneau book that uses all of these different rhetorical terms for different writing exercises for creative writers. And we will see that return with Raymond Fetterman in his Double or Nothing book. And so Roland Barthes and the theorists like Michel Foucault, they are not the only French intellectuals who are thinking about language in this way. They're definitely literary artists and theorists are fusing and creating a feedback loop with each other at this moment. And that's one of the reasons why I think post-structuralism is really still worth considering. Although I think there's a trend right now to definitely trash anything called postmodern because we've kind of moved away from that zone culturally. And so, yeah, things like like intellectual movements come in and out of fashion. But I still think it's worth really considering what post-structuralism did as a movement when we're thinking about like more contemporary literature in the 21st century. Barthes goes on to say this is Valéry stressed the linguistic and, as it were, hazardous nature of his activity. And throughout his prose works, he militated in a favor of the essentially verbal condition of literature, in the face of which all recourse to the writer's interiority seemed to him a pure superstition. Proust himself, right? In Search of Lost Time or Remembrance of Things Past. Those are the English translations. There were for a very, very long French novels, important novels of the 20th century. Proust himself, despite the apparently psychological character of what are called his analyses, I'm just trying to recover my own lost time, right? Was visibly concerned with the task of inexorably blurring by an extreme stabilization the relationship between the writer and his characters. It is not really just Proust writing down his autobiography, is what Barthes is getting at here. By making the narrator not he who has seen and felt, nor he who is writing, but he who is going to write, the young man in the novel, but in fact, how old is he and who is he, wants to write, but control the novel ends when the writing at least becomes possible, or at last becomes possible. Proust gave modern writing its epic. It's wonderful. And we think about this. I'm going to give some lectures on Bakhtin and his discourse in the novel and come back to a lot of these ideas about epic and the novel. But I love that line there. Proust gave modern writing its epic. By a radical reversal, instead of putting his life into his novel, as is so often maintained, he's just writing autobiography in an intense way. He made of his very life a work for which his own book was the model, so that it is clear to us that Charles does not imitate Montesquieu, but that Montesquieu, in anecdotal historical reality, is no more than a secondary fragment derived from Charles. So these are different like aspects of a being or aspects of a character, or that destroy the unity of what a single author autobiography might be doing in the work of Proust. Lastly, to go on no further than this prehistory of modernity, surrealism, though unable to accord language a supreme place, language being the system and the aim of the movement being romantically a direct subversion of codes, itself, moreover, illusory, a code cannot be destroyed or only played off of, contributed to the desacralization of the image of the author by ceaselessly recommending the abrupt disappointment of expectations of meaning, the famous surrealist jolt, by entrusting the hand with the task of writing as quick as possible what the head itself was unaware of. Automatic writing. This is a surrealist technique, right? We can think about later authors like Jack Kerouac, who tried versions of automatic writing. But when you actually see On the Road, if you've ever seen the actual manuscript for On the Road, which is written in this, like, on these long reams of paper that are taped together so that Kerouac doesn't have to stop typing while he's on Benzedrine. You can look, sometimes that manuscript is put on display and you can go and you can see the penciled in paragraphs and stuff afterwards. So there is editing. It's not really automatic writing when we get someone like Jacques Kerouac. But the idea for the surrealists with their writing, just like, Salvador Dali, like using absinthe and or drugs that make us fall asleep and keeping a little spoon in his hand so that like when he nods off, the spoon falls and makes a ding and wakes him back up, and then he's trying to capture that these images that come in between of conscious space of consciousness and unconsciousness. Automatic writing is the literary version from surrealists for that sort of thing. But one of the mistakes of surrealists, I don't know if I want to call it a mistake, but sometimes it's referred to as the failure of surrealism, because surrealism gets attached to psychology. And this was a critique that earlier writers have been made, especially Barthes, about Jung, right? If you remember from my earlier lectures, the idea that there's a kind of stable system from which we might derive something like an archetype is a problem. It doesn't take into account how much more fluid the unconscious might be. And because of that, it risks leading towards fascism. It risks leaning towards conservative thought, because archetypes end up being used as these kind of stabilizing figures for social structures that the nature of the structuralists, especially as they lean more political in the post-war years, They want to see if there's a way to restructure society itself. So they want to point out the ways that structures don't hold, right? And that's especially what will emerge as post-structuralism, is that we think of our ideologies are much more stable than they actually are. But when we look at the ideologies themselves are like fall apart, right? It's not that I deconstruct the ideology. No, 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 no. It's that the process of observation and interaction at the structural level shows us how non-structured our ideas or how fallible our ideas of structures are to begin with. And that way sets us into a different kind of space for what thinking is, what writing is, what literature is, what art is. But surrealism, as in the way that Barthes is sort of like contextualizing surrealism as a movement, says that surrealism kind of pushed to the edge how far we can really push signification and rely on the stability of signification. And that's why the communists, surrealists and communists, like wanted to form this kind of art that destroyed high art. But what actually happened, this is why people sometimes call it the failure of surrealist art, is that instead of democratizing and making art available to everybody through a kind of universal way of using abstraction and symbols, instead becomes the most esoteric forms of art. And I think that we could look at the MoMA, the development of the Museum of Modern Art, which has now become a very bourgeois institution, as undermining a lot of the political content that the surrealists were after. If we're really looking at the Surrealist Manifesto, right, by Julian Levy, and seeing how they are trying to fuse Freudian psychology and communism. And then you have outlier figures like Antonin Artaud, who's like in there for a little bit, edits some of the surrealism journals, but then gets really pissed off at the surrealists. We can look at the Oulipo movement, which I keep mentioning in these lectures for post-structuralism, as being formed by members who, like Raymond Queneau, who got rejected or kicked out of the surrealist movement. So Andre Breton kicks people out. And so when the Oulipo writers come along, they make a rule that once you're in the Oulipo movement, you can never be kicked out of the club. Really funny stuff that intellectual circles do. So coming back to Barthes here, that's what he's doing with automatic. He says surrealism, automatic writing pushed us to the edge. But what they were doing, even if they didn't get us to a kind of universal symbology, was they were always attacking that idea of the individual author as a bourgeois capitalist figure. So he says, linguistically, the author is never more than the instance of writing, just as the I is nothing or other than the instance of saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person, like the subjective I, as we sometimes call it in philosophy. And this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation of which defines it, suffices to make language hold together, suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. The removal of the author, one could talk here with Brecht of the veritable distancing of the author, diminishing like a figurine at the far end of the literary age, is not merely an historical fact or an act of writing. It utterly transforms the modern text, or, which is the same thing, the text is henceforth made and read in such a way that it at all levels that at all its levels, the author is absent. If you think about Bertolt Brecht and, like, again, communist theater, right? The idea that you need to have things that disrupt the illusion, the ideological illusion that we're being sucked into what's going on stage, right? So instead of being sucked into the bourgeois dream where we see a realism on stage and we're pretending like these actors are real characters, you have something that comes in and disrupts the entire scene. And the act of disruption tells the people in the audience that, like, you're in this bourgeois experience where you've paid for a ticket and you're sitting back and other people in different parts of the world are completely dying of starvation or put into concentration camps or whatever it is that's happening. Um, so uh, the temporality is different, as Barthes says. The author, when believed, is always conceived of as a past of his own book. The book and author stand automatically on a single line divided into a before and after. The author, capital A here, is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it. He's a genius who comes up with this sort of stuff. And the earlier literary work in the century was dedicated to this romantic idea of the genius, right? Wordsworth and Byron, to a certain extent, perhaps Baudelaire, although he's a little bit later, obsessed with the idea of genius or inspiration, right? We think back to William Wordsworth, and that poetry is almost this ecstatic thing that's recovered in memory, or that what happens is that the true genius is like a lightning rod for something of the divine, a channel of the divine. That's all like people like Barthes are going to say that's this is just ideological bourgeois capitalist. And so many people, my own students today in the 21st century, still think of writing that way, especially creative writers like, I'm going to write the next great American novel. I'm a genius. This is a work of genius. That is very old sounding aesthetics for our contemporary and moment, which is, again, in like our contemporary moment, it's developed well beyond the post-structuralists. But if we don't get past what the post-structuralists have already said, then at least if we're dealing with literature and thinking in terms of art as a discourse, then we're not necessarily having the same discussion. In complete contrast, he says the modern scripter is born simultaneously with the text and is in no way equipped with being a preceding or exceeding of the writing, is not the subject with the book as a predicate. There is no other time than that of the Annunciation, and every text is eternally written here and now. The text is, or it follows, that writing can no longer designate an operation of recording, notation, or representation, a depiction, as the classics would say. Rather, writing designates exactly what linguists referring to the Oxford philosophy call the performative, a rare verbal form exclusively given in the first person and in the present tense. Sometimes this is called deixis. It's the writing that, or it's the language that performs like, and now I pronounce you man in life. With this thee be wed, or now I'm breaking this bottle over the ship's bow and christening its name, or something like that. These ritualized forms of language that have to have a performance to it is what he's talking about. That's actually what writing is itself. Now listen to how closely that sounds to like Ferdinand de Saussure's sense of what parle or speech is. Writing is itself a kind of speech that allows us access to something else. It's a way into things. It's not a copy of speech itself. That's the post-structuralist term. That's what Jacques Derrida is going to say when he writes his book of grammatology, when he's thinking about what writing and sign systems are in their own performative element, and rather than it being in the Socratic sense of writing as being a copy or a representation or a third remove from an ideal sense of capital T truth. Remember the allegory of the cave, that like all we see as humans are the reflections of shadows of the light on the cave wall. But if we could turn around, we could see something more real, right? Visual art, painting is distortion of reality. It's a third remove from reality. At least useful objects like a table or really functions as a table, but it's still not as good as the ideal table, right? No. Post-structuralist thinking is completely different. That's turning all of that on its head. Having buried the author, the modern scripter can thus no longer believe, as according to the pathetic view of his predecessors, that this hand is too slow for his thought or the passion, and that consequently, making a law of necessity, he must perform this delay and indefinitely polish his form. Oh, I've got to get it out. I've got to get it out while I'm still thinking about it. For him, on the contrary, the hand cut off from any voice, born by any pure gesture of inscription and not of expression, traces a field without origin, or which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins, all originality, all the originality with which we give an author authority. We know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning. Again, that abstract meaning coming from God. I'm the writer who's a channel of the divine because I've got this genius lightning rod thing going. No. He says, we know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, a message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. Writing always resonates. There's no single text that's not inherently intertextual to begin with, because language is intertextual. The text is a tissue, he says, of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture, similar to Bouvard and Aguichet, those eternal copyists, at once sublime and comic, and whose profound ridiculousness indicates precisely the truth of writing. The writer can only imitate a gesture that is always interior, never original. His only power is to mix writings, to counter the ones with the others, in such a way that as never to rest on any one of them. Did he wish to express himself, he ought to at least know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only ready-formed dictionary. A ready-formed dictionary. Its words only explainable through the other words, and so on indefinitely. Something experienced in exemplary fashion by the young Thomas de Quincey in this is in his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, right? Early drug writing. He who was so good at Greek that in order to translate absolutely modern ideas and images into that dead language, he had so Baudelaire tells us in his book, inspired by Thomas de Quincey, right? Artificial Paradises, created for himself an unfailing dictionary, vastly more extensive and complex than those resulting from the ordinary patience of purely literary themes. What he's getting at here is the Romantic era writer of Thomas de Quincey, who in some ways people want to situate him as a romantic, is really like he's off slumming through like fields and through London and taking opium, and he's wasting away his genius as a translator. No one is as good at translating Greek as Thomas de Quincey during his era, and so he's translating these Greek experiences into English embodied experiences, and then Baudelaire is taking from that. And so in all of these contexts of these so-called writers, it's not the genius of the writer, it's the way that they are remixing and operating within a milieu of culture, of language, of sign and signification itself. Succeeding the author, to come back to Barthes here, the scripture no longer bears within him the passions, the humors, the feelings, the impressions, but rather this immense dictionary from which he draws a writing that can know no halt. Life never does more than imitate the book, and the book itself is only a tissue of signs and imitation that is lost, infinitely deferred. Over and over again, that deferral is going to come up again and again in Jacques Derrida's book. Once the author is removed, once we don't have this kind of bourgeois genius fantasy of the author, says Barthes, the claim to decipher a text becomes quite futile. It's not just an idea of a message put into the piece of writing to be deciphered by the reader. To give a text an author is to impose a limit on the text, to furnish it with a style signified, to close the writing. Such a conception suits criticism very well. The latter then allotting itself a more important task of discovering the author. Who is the author? What was really beneath their work? When the author has been found, then the text has been explained. Victory for the critic. Hence, there is no surprise that in the fact that historically the reign of the author has also been that of the critic, with capital C here, nor again in the fact that criticism, be it new, is today undermined along with the author. In the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. Critical writing, literary theory, even this text itself, it's not deciphering Balzac or Mallarmé or Valby, any more than it's the genius work of some individual named Barthes. Um, it's not a process of disentangling and deciphering. The structure can be followed, he says. So in the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing to be deciphered. Disentanglement is not pulling meaning as a mystical idea, but dealing with the materiality of the text, like a bunch of net or webbing that needs to be disentangled. The structure can be followed, run like a thread of a stocking at every point and at every level, but there is nothing beneath. The space of writing is to be ranged over, not pierced. Writing ceaselessly posits meaning ceaselessly to evaporate it, carrying it out the systemic exemption of meaning. In precisely this way, literature, it would be better from now on to say writing, by refusing to assign the secret an ultimate meaning to the text and to the world as text, liberates what might be called an anti-theological activity, an activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix meaning is, in the end, to refuse God and his hypostases, reason, science, and law. And so think about this again in the context of writing Degree Zero, the broader French context of the late 50s and 60s, in which Barthes is operating here. So we want to destroy bourgeois culture. We want to destroy this idea of capitalist culture, which maintains this idea of a genius, that maintains class hierarchies between different people. And instead, we want to maybe we have to get rid of the concept of literature because it's too loaded down with classist baggage, and just refer to writing itself. It's like it's the writing on this person's business card. It's the writing that's in this book this way. Let's have a really, really flexible sense of what writing is and not impose that category of literature onto it. Very much part of the post-structural moment. Then he says, let's come back to Balzac and to the Balzac sentence. No one person in this text says it. Its source, its voice is not the pure, true place of writing, which is reading. Another very precise example will make this clear. Very recent research by J.P. Bernat has demonstrated that the constitutively ambiguous nature of Greek tragedy, its text being woven from the words and the double meanings that the characters understand unilaterally, this perpetual misunderstanding is exactly what constitutes the tragic. And this is what made different writers like Sophocles were dealing with mythological texts. They're remixing things for the cultural performances that they're putting on stage itself. And they're bringing a kind of presence to the moment of what Greek theater and Greek tragedy is. That moment that can't be explained. That moment that everything leads into, and where Oedipus can't it's not about Oedipus. Like sometimes my modern students want to say, like, oh, if Oedipus would have done this other thing, like they read Oedipus as morally flawed in some way, but the way that the Greeks portraying it is like, no, even the gods pity the tragic character because there's nothing that Oedipus could have done to escape his fate. That's the point. So thus is revealed the total existence of writing. The text is made of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into the mutual relations of the dialogue. And the multiplicity focused on in that place is the reader, not, as was hitherto said, the author. The reader is the space in which all the quotations that make up the writing are inscribed themselves. And so now when we think about writers like Roland Barthes or writers like Jacques Derrida, they're always playing with language. Every time that there's a pun or a different meaning on a sound of a word that can be made, they're going to make a double entendre or a double meaning. They're going to saturate the language, or they're going to point out the fact that language is always saturated with too much meaning, so that language itself becomes destabilized. And they want us to be interacting as readers in that space of an interaction with language. And so when people point out that like the post-structuralists, it's hard to understand them or they're confusing and all that stuff, yeah, that's part of the whole point, right? Like the point is to disrupt and alienate ourselves from the adherences that we have to conventional meaning and to open up a kind of flexibility of the scripter writer and the ledger reader who is not deciphering a text, but is operating in the milieu of writing in the present moment that writing is itself. Classic criticism, to come back to Barthes here, has never paid any attention to the reader, for it, the writer, is only the person in literature. We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled by no longer by the arrogant anti-frastical recriminations of a good society in favor with the very thing that it sets aside and calls sacred, or what it ignores or smothers or destroys. We know that to give writing a future, it's necessary to overthrow the myth of the author. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Come back to these ideas in the context of literature itself, as literary writers are dealing with this idea of what it means to be a writer and not a capital A author. And I'll suggest that Raymond Fetterman is a prime example of this, but that's a future lecture. It's going to take us out because I don't think that people are generally when they think structuralist, their mind doesn't necessarily go to this Jewish writer, Raymond Fetterman, but I'm going to keep that lecture in this series on structuralism so that people can see what it looks like in performance in terms of creativity. Thanks very much for watching. Have a great night, morning, afternoon, wherever and wherever you are, because we are in a contextless environment, right? Remember that Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault and the post-structuralists were writing about this decontextualized space that is so familiar to us because of the internet, because we interact with text and in the web of what text is every day in our contemporary lives, when we're interacting with our phones, through writing, through the writing that's been written in code for us. And that's how you are getting access to even this video, right? Okay, have a great day, morning, afternoon, whenever, wherever you are. We'll come back to you in another lecture. Thanks for watching. Support us on Patreon if this is helpful for you. Thanks.